Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Take your plans out of the group chat and get long weekend ready in new Abercrombie. From day to night, pack new outfits for every part of your itinerary. Grabbing brunch? Throw on the A&F Mila dress. Then head to your dinner reservation in their new bubble hem mini dress. And yes, permission to overpack for pics with the girls. Abercrombie's best-selling Scarlet Squirt deserves a post in your feed. Your plans are worth it. Shop Abercrombie's new long weekend collection online or in store.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by Professor of Law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin.
Oh, hey, Michael. It's
hey,
great
Ken.
to be back. Yeah,
it's good to be doing the show with you. It's not something we get to do that often, and I know we have a number of legal issues teed up that I think are right in your wheelhouse, and so I'm looking forward to it on this Ides of March episode. I don't know if you're wearing today, Ken, but I believe that's what we're supposed to do on the Ides of March, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's almost St. Patrick's Day, too.
There you go. So a happier holiday as opposed to stabbing of tyrants sort of thing. But anyway, well, we're going to open today with, I'll call it a potential crisis. Now, I say that it's more of a sort of a, hey, is that an iceberg out there kind of crisis as opposed to, oh, my God, man to lifeboats kind of crisis. And here's what I mean. Our revenue for the podcast is down around 28% over the last couple of years, despite steady listener numbers. And the main reason is changes in podcast advertising that have really hit independent shows like ours particularly hard. And 28% decline, that is not sustainable for us over the long term. And honestly, the audience for bipartisan political discussion was never huge to begin with, and it seems to be shrinking of late. And since we're not going to abandon our founding principles just to chase downloads, it's largely up to you guys to help keep the Politics Guys alive for the long term. So if what we do matters to you and you're not already a supporter, please consider becoming one. Our tiers, they start at $5 a month. That's less than a reasonably sized espresso drink at most places these days. And if you're already supporting us and you can help out a bit more, either by upgrading your tier or making a one-time donation through Venmo or PayPal, that would be fantastic. Earlier this week, actually, I shared this sort of financial update with our supporters on Discord and Slack, and several of them, I'm happy to say, have already stepped up in a big way. We have a new executive producer, Derek Schmidt, and Derek told me, I really enjoy the discussions on the show. He likes hearing other opinions and says, this is one of the few places I get a variety of them. We've also received a very generous $300 Venmo donation from a longtime supporter who wants to remain anonymous. And they said they value the space we've created. They encourage others to spread the word and, if possible, increase their support. Also, this is a big deal for us, they've promised to donate another $300 if we get 5 new supporters at the $5 or higher level who make yearly pledges, which, by the way, saves you 10% over monthly support. And really, how folks respond to this will determine whether the Politics Guys is around to cover the midterms and the rest of the Trump administration, or whether we end up going silent at some point. And I know we have fantastic listeners. Just this week, Michael recently became a yearly Patreon supporter. Thank you very much. And I am optimistic, but in the end, it's up to you. So thanks very much for your support. We really do appreciate it. All right. With that, let's get started. On Tuesday, the House passed legislation to fund the government through September 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. And the bill keeps spending largely unchanged, aside from, I believe, around $6 billion more in defense, eliminates earmarks for projects in legislators' districts, and cuts the District of Columbia's budget by $1 billion, which D.C. officials say would require somewhere around a 16% cut to all remaining unspent funds. The House vote was 217 to 213, largely along party lines. Only one Democrat, Jarrett Golden of Maine, voted with every Republican except for Kentucky's Thomas Massie, who felt that there was too much spending in this CR. And after the vote, the House adjourned, which essentially forced the Senate to either pass the House bill or shut down the government. And initially, it seemed like Senate Democrats were willing to force a government shutdown by not voting for it in sufficient numbers to prevent a filibuster or to allow for cloture. But late this week, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer changed course, saying there are no winners in a government shutdown. It's not really a decision. It's a Hobson's choice. Either proceed with the bill before us or risk Donald Trump throwing America into the chaos of a shutdown. And some Senate Democrats hoped they could bargain for a shorter CR that would fund the government for the next month. But congressional Republicans and the Trump administration have essentially zero interest in yet another budget fight in the fiscal year that, by the way, is nearly half over. And so in the end, cloture was invoked 62 to 38. And Senate Democrats, though, did get votes on several amendments, including one from Senator Duckworth of Illinois, that would have made veterans fired from federal jobs without cause eligible for reinstatement. On that, every Democrat voted for it. Every Republican voted in opposition. And then in the final vote in the Senate, 54-46 along party lines. Again, we have these crazy Kentucky representatives. This time it was Rand Paul who joined the Democrats in opposition because, just like Thomas Massie, he felt there was too much spending in this for sure. So, Ken, what are your thoughts about this latest CR, as well as the direction that Senate Democrats ended up taking on it?
You know, I would have sided with the majority of the Senate Democrats who wanted to not pass the CR and shut down the government. But I actually think it's a very close question. I agree with Schumer calling it a Hobson's choice, where, you know, either vote would have been disastrous. I mean, I agree with him that a shutdown would have been disastrous. I also think passing it is disastrous. But yet what I'm really concerned about more than which of the two, you know, horrific alternatives they took was, I do think it was divisive within the Democrats, and I think it's not good that the Democrats are getting disunified over this issue, and I think even though I would have been on the side of the 40 and not on the side of not 40, 30, 36, I guess, and not on the side of the 10. You know, I would not be calling for Schumer's ouster, for him to be primaried or anything like that. I think you know, unification is very important now, and so that's kind of my systemic take on it. I don't know if you wanted me to go into more detail than that.
Yeah, before we do on that, I wonder how much of that is maybe performative isn't exactly the right word, but I think that most Senate and House Democrats are smart enough to understand the options, but also know that they need to do things to placate their base. And so they couldn't just say, well, yeah, we're going to roll over, because so many, especially activists on the left, have been calling for Democrats to do something. And I think initially my sense was that Schumer wanted to push a little bit, just to say he pushed, and hoped maybe to get a couple of concessions. That was a long shot, and then sort of pulled back. I think I agree with you. It's a close question. And I don't know that the disunity among congressional Democrats is as great as it appears. I think a lot of it is just sort of playing to that base, or maybe that's just my hopes kind of overriding and other things. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll tell you, I spent this whole week in New York. I just got back last night, and I think that if AOC actually decided to primary Schumer in the next New York Senate election, she'd topple him. And I think there's a lot of call for that there. You know, we're living out here in Ohio, and things are different. But I think in the blue states, and actually, to me, this is the main reason I would have voted to shut down the government rather than voted to pass the CR, is that I think that it's very deflating to the Democratic base, which just really wants to see more fight. That the fight just didn't materialize. And I think there actually is, tremendous anger about it. And I think on the policy issue of whether it would be better to shut down the government or whether to pass the CR, I honestly don't know. But on the political ramifications of it, I think it would have been better to not pass the CR, to shut down the government, because I think blue state activists who are angry and freaked out by everything that Trump is doing, want to see some the Democrats standing up against it somehow, rather than rolling over. So I think that's real. I don't think it's just theatrical.
I agree with that anger from the progressive base being real. But I also think that as a matter of policy, Schumer is right. I mean, if there's forcing a shutdown with a party in power that actually doesn't like government and really wants to shut down as much of government as they possibly can, and then giving them the ability to essentially designate certain employees as essential and non-essential, and furloughing a whole bunch of folks. And, there wouldn't be necessarily a whole lot of incentive for Republicans to reopen the government. I think Democrats would have gotten the blame for shutting down the government, and they would have given Trump and Musk and that whole let's destroy government as we know it group more of what they wanted. And so I get the feeling that we should fight, but sometimes you're just not in a position to fight, and that stinks, but that's just how it is. I mean, if people want to fight, they need to focus on the midterms. They need to focus on legal challenges, but we just don't have the numbers in the House or the Senate to really do much of anything.
Well, I agree with everything you said, but I think you gave all the reasons not to shut down the government, and I think they're all correct. But I think you didn't give the reasons to shut down the government, which I think are also correct, right? And it actually would greatly impair the ability of Trump to do a lot of the things that he's doing. Because, for instance, even though he could declare, ICE and all these agencies essential and tell those people to keep working, they wouldn't be getting paid. And if that dragged out for a long time, they could quit. They're not, there's a limit to how long people are going to do jobs, even if they've been declared essential workers, if there's no end in sight to the fact that they're not getting paid a salary. And I also think that, people wouldn't get their tax refunds and things like that. And I think that it would be, even though, what you're looking at is because the Democrats would have the ability to lift that filibuster, that the Democrats could be blamed for keeping the government shut down. But I actually think there's broader kind of themes at play. The Republicans are so consistently the ones that are trying to shut down the government. And Trump, in fact, had already shut down every part of the government that he doesn't like. That's what he and Musk have been doing the last couple of weeks. That I think that, although Republicans would blame the Democrats for shutting down the government, I think Democrats and a lot of independents who seem to already be quite critical of what Musk has been up to would actually accept the narrative that it's better to shut down the whole government than just to let Trump, illegally shut down get away with illegally shutting down whatever parts of the government he wants to shut down and not enforcing whatever laws he doesn't want to enforce and not releasing whatever funds that have already been appropriated he doesn't want to release. So I think the question of which gives him more power and it's I think it cuts both ways there. I don't think it's a clear political loss for the Dems, especially when most Dems were calling for it. They mostly were calling for the complete shutdown.
Yeah, I think those are some reasonable arguments. And going back to what you said at the beginning, this is a close sort of question. I tend to maybe go the other way because my sense is that the easier argument to make about who's to blame would be the Republicans' argument to make. And so that's maybe the lens through which I see it. But another thing related to this, I think that's pretty important to bring up is the impoundment issue. Because Vice President Vance has pretty much, I think as much as said, might have literally said to the Republican conference, listen, don't worry about this. You can pass this to the Freedom Caucus, who are the folks who, most likely to vote against any kind of spending, because we're just not going to spend the money that we don't want to spend in the first place. And certainly the administration has been trying to set up this impoundment fight, move this issue up to and eventually get the Supreme Court to rule on it. And so to me, I think that made it a little easier for some of the Freedom Caucus folks, aside from Massey, to vote for this. But I also wonder what exactly will happen when this issue at some point does come before the court. What's your take on that, the whole impoundment issue?
Well, so like anything with our current corrupt Supreme Court, right? The law and the precedents on this issue are extremely clear, and that's the reason why Trump has lost every single lower court case that revolves around the merits of him impounding these funds. You know, he's managed to skate by in a few cases because there was procedural problems about who was bringing the cases or whether things had to go first to the Merit Systems Protection Board before they could go to court and things like that. But every court that reached the merits of the impoundment issue correctly ruled, and it's indisputable, that under existing statutory law and existing Supreme Court precedent that affirms the constitutionality of that statutory law, all of this impoundment is just totally illegal and should be being instantly reversed by courts. And I'll go a little deeper into that. The impoundment was actually something that was a big policy of President Richard Nixon. You know, he came into office in '68. Both the Congress and the White House had been in Democratic hands for a long time. At that point, the Congress basically since the late '40s, and the White House, with the one interruption of Eisenhower, who was actually a pretty big spender also, had been in Democratic hands as well. And so the budgets were not the kind of budgets that Nixon liked. And he did start impounding a lot of funds. And Congress, you know, first, you know, there were a series of skirmishes in court when it wasn't really clear under the statutory law whether he had the power to impound or not. There were arguments both ways at the time, but those got resolved by a statute called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 because of the clashes with Nixon. And the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 lays out in federal law a framework by which presidents can sometimes delay the release of funds, but they have to follow certain procedures to do it. And they can't actually cancel the expenditure of funds. They can just delay sometimes if they use certain procedures. And that got challenged, and the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of that in a case called Train versus the United States that was decided soon after the Impoundment Control Act was enacted. In fact, the court went even stronger in that direction 20 years later, because in 1996, 20 years after the impoundment control was sustained, Congress actually enacted a line item veto act, and they gave President Clinton a line item veto, which is something many governors have, but our Constitution doesn't give to the president. And in this case, what that meant was that all Congress was saying was, we actually do want to authorize the president to do impoundment. And so whereas the Impoundment Control Act had generally prohibited impoundment, the Line Item Veto Act authorized impoundment of certain line items in the budget. And President Clinton used it just to strike two items of spending in the 1997 budget, the first budget after the Line Item Veto Act was enacted. And in a case called Clinton versus New York, the court held that the president can't do impoundment even when Congress actually authorizes him to do impoundment, that Congress cannot appropriate funds and then give the president the statutory authority to not release those funds. So we have a pretty unbroken, and I even think Clinton v. New York is probably wrongly decided. I think Congress should be able to authorize impoundment, but Clinton versus New York says that it can't. And Train versus New York very clearly said 20 years earlier that when Congress appropriates funds and doesn't authorize impoundment, they can't be impounded. They must be released.
Yeah, I think in the end, unlike you, while I often disagree with the Supreme Court, I don't see the court as at all corrupt. And in the end, I think that if this does get before the court, that they will follow these long-standing and very clear precedents. And at best, it's maybe a 7-2 decision, but the right way. So, but
yeah, I got to disagree. I think they're more likely to go the wrong way, because of their corruption.
Well, I think we'll get a chance to see which one of us takes a victory lap. I think we both hope it's me on this, but we'll see. And I guess also on this, there's, even if the court does rule that way, there's still a lot of damage can be done when funds are impounded or withheld for the amount of time it might take for some, though I would imagine in the interim, there would be TROs or preliminary injunctions that might be able to stop that, depending on, I don't know, we'll see about that, but maybe there wouldn't necessarily be that much damage. I don't know.
Well, I will say the issue of TROs is interesting in and of itself. That's temporary restraining orders for the listeners who didn't know what that was. So it's courts do have the power, and it's common for them to use it. That if there's a case that's filed, and generally it will be the plaintiff that will say, I'm filing this case and I want to litigate this case, but even while the case is being litigated, I'm being harmed so much by what the defendant has done that I want the court to order the status quo to be maintained during the course of the case. And that is what's sometimes called a temporary restraining order. In different circumstances, that can be called a preliminary injunction. But so courts have the power to do that. But before a court would give a TRO, they would have to find that the moving party who's asking for the TRO would suffer significant or even irreparable injury if the defendant was allowed to continue with the bad conduct while the case was being litigated, and also that the plaintiff has a likelihood of success on the merits. So all of that stuff is very well established part of law, but there's an aspect of this that's much more controversial, which is really only because of right-wing district judges like Judge Kaczmarek in Texas. It's become fairly common in recent years that if a plaintiff seeks a temporary restraining order against the United States government, and typically they go to the correct right-wing judge, the right-wing judge will give them a national temporary restraining order, whereas in the past it was much more common for the temporary restraining orders only to take place as between the parties that are actually in the litigation, which would typically mean only within the geographic district where the case is being litigated. And there's been a lot of controversy around national temporary restraining orders. And of course, in the current spate of recent litigation against all these Trump initiatives, particularly a lot of the layoffs which involve impoundment, the Dems have been, saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And they've been seeking national restraining orders, and they've been seeking them in front of judges in blue states and getting a lot of them. And the Supreme Court has just granted cert to review that practice, not to review the underlying impoundment questions yet, but just to review the practice of federal district judges in a particular district in the course of litigation between two parties. Typically one of the parties is the United States government, but where a plaintiff sues the United States government, can a federal district judge give a temporary restraining order that applies against the government everywhere in the country, or can they only give it either within their own geographic jurisdiction or even only as between the parties? So that is a case that has a potential to really affect the question that you asked a minute ago about what happens before you get the reversals on the merits. That's going to be affected a lot by whether the temporary restraining orders can apply nationally or just locally. Yeah,
and I know a number of justices have indicated their displeasure with those national TROs. Justice Thomas and a few others have been very, very outspoken on that. So I think there might be a reasonable chance that we might see some sort of a change to that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, especially because now, and I always think that because they are corrupt, the time that we'll see that change will be when it benefits Trump, right? I mean, they let all these right-wing judges give all these national TROs against Biden, again and again and again. And it was true, as you say, that a couple of the conservative justices expressed qualms about the national TROs even then. But I think they're actually going to produce a majority to end that practice in order to let Trump keep breaking the law while cases are being litigated.
Right. I disagree with the corrupt thing, but I do think that I do agree with you on what I think the court will end up doing. And I think they're going to do it because you're going to hate this. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it might. I'll just say I don't think it's clearly the wrong thing to do. So I'm not going to go to bat for temporary restraining orders, but I think it's a close question.
All right.
Campfire season's back, and that means s'mores. But when you're at home treating yourself, take them over ice with Dunkin' S'mores Cold Brew Concentrate. And suddenly you're always treating yourself. The home with Dunkin' is where you want to be. Click or tap the banner to shop now.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the fulfilling work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
Well, let's move on to foreign affairs, move on to Ukraine. And as most people I'm sure know, Ukraine has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire with Russia after meetings earlier this week with U.S. officials in Saudi Arabia. And in return, the U.S. lifted its pause on intelligence sharing and military assistance to Ukraine. Now, understandably, the ceasefire doesn't take effect unless Russia also agrees. And Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has said, well, he agrees with the idea of a ceasefire, but Moscow wants to ensure that Ukrainian forces won't be able to use this period to rest up, to resupply. He also says he won't allow Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk region to peacefully withdraw, saying that Ukraine should order them to surrender. And what the U.S. has been doing, we, of course, know about the pressure on Ukraine, but the Trump administration also tried to place some additional pressure on Russia by putting more sanctions on their oil, gas, and banking industries by further restricting access to U.S. banking systems. Or actually, I should say, they did not renew a 60-day exemption for certain Russian energy transactions that was put in place at the end of the Biden administration. So slight difference there. But Ken, my sense of this is that this ceasefire proposal is going nowhere fast. What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's how it seems to me. I think Zelensky has said that, he will accept any unconditional ceasefire for any period of time. But, basically Putin keeps adding more and more conditions. And, it doesn't seem to me that the Trump administration is going to put enough pressure on Putin to really, I don't even know exactly how they could, but I think the only way to put pressure on Putin is to keep supporting Ukraine's war effort militarily. I think when you're talking about actually negotiating a ceasefire, I don't know how they can put enough pressure on Putin, but I also think they're not going to try that hard.
Yeah, I agree, especially given the fact that at this point, Putin has about zero incentive to accept anything, given that Russia's been making military gains. And I mean, why would he agree to a ceasefire when he has a certain amount of momentum? Granted, momentum that happened in part because Trump decided to cut off assistance and intelligence sharing for a while. So, but also, I mean, Putin wants to stay on Trump's good side. So there's no reason he has to just object and say, no, I'm not going to agree to a ceasefire, just throw out all these conditions that are reasonable. Little things haggle forever while Russia makes more advances, presumably. And I should say, also, Secretary of State Rubio and a number of others in the Trump administration have made it really clear that as part of any peace deal, Ukraine will have to cede territory taken by Russia. And that would mean, at a bare minimum, formally accepting Russia's illegal annexation of the Crimea region back in 2014, and almost certainly allowing Russia to keep some of the territory it's currently holding in eastern Ukraine, as well as they're going to demand a guarantee that there won't be any foreign troops in Ukraine, unless they're Russian, of course, but and that Ukraine won't be allowed to join NATO, probably an end to Western military assistance to Ukraine. There's no way Ukraine agrees to that. And also, I don't know what conditions Russia would agree to, what they're willing to give up. I don't think they're really willing to give up much of anything is my take. What do you think?
Yeah, the same. I mean, I think, and also if Trump is going to be so kind of flighty, I guess, where it's like one day he's cutting off aid to Ukraine, the next day he's returning some military intelligence sharing, maybe the next day he's cutting that off again. That's really all Putin needs. Militarily, Putin knows that he can achieve his objectives in Ukraine if the U.S. is going to be such a fair weather friend to Ukraine, just as much as if the U.S. had totally turned against Ukraine. So, I think that Ukraine is not in a great position But I think they have no real choice but to keep fighting and hope that Europe will help them out more. And it looks like at least some of the European countries are trying to gear up to do that. I don't know how quickly they'll be able to do that. But, even if Ukraine fights and fights and fights and loses, that doesn't resolve things forever, as we see in places like Palestine, right? Whereas, so I think Ukraine may have reason to keep fighting, even if they can't win, because, they can always try again to liberate themselves, if Europe gets to a point later where it gives them more help or something. So I think that I think that this is all going nowhere. And I think Putin thinks he's in the catbird seat. Probably in the short run, he is in the catbird seat. And so he's just going to, keep adding conditions and not really trying to get to a peace.
Yeah, I agree. I think the worst case scenario might actually be a ceasefire that's agreed to almost essentially all on Russia's terms, which will give Putin and his forces the chance to resupply, rest up, put more troops on the ground, because I have no doubt it's not like he's going to say, okay, well, we tried and oh, well. I think he's going to keep on going until he denazifies Ukraine. Yeah. I don't see anyone stopping that. And so I think the worst outcome would be agreeing to a ceasefire on strictly Russia's terms. But honestly, that's the only ceasefire agreement I see that's potentially possible in the short term.
Right. And there's no reason for Ukraine to agree to that. So I think they won't. And I don't think Trump will do anything about it. In fact, I tend to see, I don't know what you think about this, Michael, but all Trump's talk about, we're going to take over Canada, we're going to take over Greenland, we're going to take over Panama, all that kind of talk, which is in a certain literal level, obviously going nowhere. I think it might really be about normalizing this idea of taking foreign territory, for the benefit of Putin in Ukraine, that Putin's the one actually doing this, but Trump's talking about it like it's a reasonable way for a great power to proceed. And I think that's kind of the real subtext of all that stuff.
I don't think that's a crazy idea. I've suggested before on the show that Putin might see the world, but well, he's the boss of North and South America. Essentially, Putin is the boss of Russia and those parts of Asia and Eastern Europe that are kind of abut that. And then, she, of course, is the boss of Asia, and bosses get to do what they want in their own territory.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Trump will do anything if she actually finally attacks Taiwan like he's been talking about all these years.
I find it hard to believe. And that, of course, concerns me more than a little bit. And I think concerns a lot of other folks as well. So not exactly a pretty picture, certainly a very disappointing week, I would say, for Ukraine, but nothing we didn't expect at this point.
Right.
All right, well, let's move. Well, this isn't exactly a domestic policy thing because it involves a foreign national. A week ago, U.S. immigration officials arrested Mahmoud Khalil. Sorry about that, stumbling over the name. He's a green card holder, which means that while he's not a U.S. citizen, he is a lawful permanent resident. He's also married to a U.S. citizen. And Khalil is not being charged with a crime, but he faces deportation under a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 that gives the U.S. the authority to deport any alien whose presence or activities in the U.S. would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. Now, the administration argues that Khalil's presence in the country does pose serious adverse consequences based on what they characterize as his inciting anti-Semitic violence on college campuses. He was one of the leaders of the pro-Hamas protests at Columbia last spring, where he was a student. Now, as of today, at least the last time I checked, Khalil is being held at an ICE detention facility in Louisiana following a hearing in New York where federal judge Jesse Furman halted the administration's attempt to deport Khalil until the court could rule on his challenge to the deportation order. The judge also ordered that Khalil be allowed to speak privately with his attorneys, which he hadn't been able to do since his arrest. And I think a big question here is whether Khalil is simply exercising his First Amendment rights to free speech, or if he presents a true threat to U.S. foreign policy. And I even go further than that and question whether that provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act being cited is even constitutional. And it's an important question, not just for Khalil, but from others who may soon, in fact, a couple others now who are in similar situations. President Trump said when Khalil was arrested, this is the first of many to come, and we will find, apprehend, and deport these terrorist sympathizers from our country, never to return again. And Secretary of State Rubio posted on X said the administration will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported. And Ken, I'm really glad we're doing the show today because I'm sure that you can shed some light on, well, at least what I seem to believe are some pretty important constitutional issues here. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, well, first, I agree that the constitutional issues are important. But in terms of the Supreme Court's doctrine, I think the constitutional questions are maybe a little closer than they should be. But I also think the statutory issues are the really clear ones, that everything Trump is doing is just totally illegal under the Immigration and Nationality Act in this case. And so it's less necessary to reach the First Amendment issues. And, they keep citing the one provision that you cited also that gives a basis for revoking a green card if the alien's presence or activities in the United States would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. That's the language that the Homeland Security is putting out there, that Rubio is putting out there, which is true. I mean, that is part of the Immigration Nationality Act. That is a basis for deporting someone. But the Immigration Nationality Act has processes and procedures that have to be followed to deport a green card holder. And so those allegations that this alien's presence would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences, those have to be proved to the satisfaction of an immigration judge before it would become legal to take away somebody's green card. And, it's typically only used when when green card holders have actually been convicted of crimes. Now, the statutory language isn't limited only to people who've actually been convicted of crimes, but it is limited only to people whose presence, in fact, would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. And so, this is a person who's never been, arrested, never been charged with a crime, never even been accused of a crime, who's been accused of, not taking part in some protests at Columbia. I would not call them pro-Hamas protests. I would call them protests against the Israeli government's conduct of the war in Gaza and against, I guess, Columbia University being invested in having some of its endowment money invested in Israel. But I don't think it's obvious that that's pro-Hamas. A very large number of Columbia students took part in those protests. In fact, I think even just among the Jewish students at Columbia, more of the Jewish students at Columbia were in support of the protests than in opposition to the protests. And so I don't see the how it could be proved out that participation in a mass protest. And I guess this guy had a little bit more of a leadership role, but that was in terms of that he was appointed as a negotiator with the university and was actually talking to the university. And the university didn't have any complaints about his conduct in that regard. I don't think it would have been possible to prove to the satisfaction of an immigration judge that statutory standard was met. And certainly the nobody tried, right? He was, in fact, when they came to arrest him, they didn't even know he was a green card holder. And when they thought he only had a student visa, and when they found out that he was a green card holder, then they just told him that his green card had already been revoked as well, which was not true at the time they told him that, although it may have become true, shortly afterwards. But again, not using the proper procedures. So to me, that's the real clear legal issue. On First Amendment issues, it's complicated because there's a little bit of a disjunction, I think, in the First Amendment law about the Congress is allowed to take account of politics in deciding whether to give an alien a visa to come here in ways that they would not be allowed to take account of politics when dealing with American citizens. So I think what Trump is trying to argue now, and I think Rubio expressly even said this in his statement, is that if someone has political perspectives that would justify not admitting them to the United States under current law, then that should justify revoking their green cards. Now, I don't think that's right, but I think that hasn't been explicitly litigated. But the First Amendment generally does protect all persons who are within the the geographic jurisdiction of the United States. And I think the difference between an alien outside the United States who applies to come here and a green card holder who's an alien but is inside the United States is that usually constitutional rights attach from being present in the territory of the United States.
Yeah, I certainly agree on the due process stuff. And even the Wall Street Journal's editorial board said, hey, this Khalil might deserve to be deported, but he also deserves due process. And also just revoking green cards as a policy, where they put it, would have costs beyond any individual's fate. And I think it's absolutely right. And it kind of blows my mind, Ken, because this seems to be so simple and so obvious that the sort of bizarre way that they dealt with, as you already mentioned, the arrest, but then moving him around a bunch and just planning on deporting him without any kind of hearing. Anyone with half a brain would have to know that, God, there are all kinds of due process violations right here. And I would think that if they had just gone through the process, they could have at least gotten a hearing and possibly gotten him deported without all this. But it just kind of boggles my mind why they would approach it this way.
Well, I don't think they could have got him deported. That's really what I was saying. I don't think he did anything that any judge would have agreed meets that statutory standard. So I think certainly an immigration judge would have found that he wouldn't be deportable. I think a federal district judge will find in this very case that he didn't, because there is going to be some litigation on the facts now, in the case that the habeas case that's already been filed, and I would expect that to conclude that he did not meet the statutory standard to be deported. So I think that, partly they're doing this just to try to continue to erode our separation of powers, our legal system, to try to, entrench lawless authoritarianism a little bit more, and to have some theater. But I think also, I don't think they could have possibly sustained these allegations in a hearing on these actual facts.
I wonder, maybe I think it's a closer question than you do, because it seems to me that the legislation is written in a very sort of broad way. And if a court was inclined to give the administration the benefit of the doubt, as often they do on national security type measures, you can say, well, is this a reasonable ground to believe that this person's presence or activities could have potentially adverse foreign policy consequences? Well, that's pretty subjective. And I could see a lot of judges saying, you know what, we defer to the administration on these sort of national security, foreign policy type things.
Yeah, I don't think so in this case, because there's no evidence at all that he did anything. I mean, wasn't in communication with Hamas or anything like that, although they sometimes try to blur that. He didn't do anything that, very large numbers of Columbia students weren't doing. The idea that, that if only, the handful of Palestinian nationals who are physically present in the United States had not participated in all these university protests against the war, that would have had any impact at all on those protests. I mean, it's almost entirely Americans that are American students that are participating in these protests. So what's the foreign policy consequence of one person participating in a mass protest being Palestinian? I think it would be pretty hard. I mean, there may be some deference. I also think that, the traditional deference that administrations have received in these kind of judgments, very few federal judges who aren't Republicans are going to give that deference to Trump, because he's such a liar and he's established it again and again and again. And the administration comes into court and says implausible things or things that can easily be proved to be false. So, I think that the kind of deference that you're talking about is because the Justice Department, has worked for a century to build up credibility. But I think that can go away pretty quickly, just the same way, the stress on our alliances with our allies and things like that can go away pretty quickly. I do think, again, the judiciary is becoming more partisan, but most of these cases are going to be brought in blue states. And I really don't think that blue state judges would give that kind of deference to implausible Trump administration claims that are manufactured post hoc to cover up illegality.
Maybe you're right, but I do think that, a lot of the blue states are in circuits where there also are sort of liberal Democrat-appointed majority judges as well. But I think if you move things up to the Supreme Court, where this could eventually end up, I could easily see a majority of the court, given their strong inclination to buy into unitary executive sort of views of things, to actually say, well, no, we actually agree that the administration gets a lot of deference. And so I agree with you on the district court and maybe the appellate court level, but it seems to me at the Supreme Court level, the administration might have a lot better shot. What do you think?
Well, I'm sure you're right about that, but I'm gonna have to point out that that's another example of the corruption, because this is the exact same Supreme Court that literally just ended the Chevron doctrine, right? When Joe Biden was president, this court said that, despite, 40 years of doctrine and about 60 years of practice, because the Chevron doctrine existed before Chevron, that they actually would not defer to administrative interpretations of ambiguities in statutes. And yet, I certainly agree with you that if we're talking about Trump, then they will. But I don't see how that could be interpreted as anything other than corruption when you're talking about the court that just decided the Loper-Bright case.
Yeah, I see it less as corruption and more as the court going in a direction of saying, well, there's this historic deference to the executive, particularly on national security and foreign policy. And so, but again, we tend to interpret what the court does through very different lenses, of course. So, but we both agree on, I think, the fact that if this does get to the Supreme Court, that there's a good chance that the court would rule that the administration does have quite a bit of deference. But even so, I think before it got to that point, I would be surprised if the court didn't say that, well, listen, even if folks deserve to be deported, they still have due process rights.
Well, if they side with Trump on the deportation, I think they're not going to do that. I think if they base it on the fact that they're not going to look at what the facts of the case are, and they're not going to worry too much about what the correct interpretation of the statute is, but they're just going to defer to the executive, then I actually don't see what room there would be for due process there. Why would they need it?
Well, I guess I meant that assuming that the Trump administration did end up having to go through that process and then deport, because it could be, this could be challenged on two grounds, right? Well, first off, the courts could say, well, he hasn't had, Khalil hasn't had his due process rights, then maybe it goes through the process and in the end, he ends up being deported, and that could be challenged. And then I would think that's when the court could possibly rule on that secondary issue. No?
The whole concept of due process would imply that it matters what the facts are and that it matters what the law means. And I think you and I both agreed that, if the Supreme Court gets this case, they're going to say it doesn't matter what the facts are and it doesn't matter what the law means. What matters is that we defer to the executive when it's Trump on these national security questions. And so there's actually no role for due process there. There's nothing that would happen in a hearing. If at the end of it, the court is going to say, okay, there was a hearing, but now it doesn't matter what facts were found. It doesn't matter what's the best interpretation of the law. It just matters that, the monarchical executive has declared that this person needs to go.
And so in the end, do you think that Mahmoud Khalil will end up going?
Well, he's going to win his case in the federal district court, and the Second Circuit is going to affirm that, I think. So I think he's got a fair, unfortunately, he's still being detained, and I think the judge should have ordered him immediately released. But he, I think he's going to win these cases. I don't know how long this is going to drag out. I don't know who would be president by the time it would get to the Supreme Court. So I don't know. But I think if it actually got to the Supreme Court, I agree with you. They're going to find a way to side with Trump, even though they would be at that point in time not deferring to a factual record that was found in the lower court cases and not following their own opinion in Loper-Bright, that the court has to actually come up with the interpretation of the law, not defer to the executive's interpretation.
And as you mentioned to me before we started recording, that this is actually going on in a number of other cases as well, right? So we're not surprised by that, hardly.
Yeah, let me just talk briefly about the two other cases at Columbia. So there's three people associated with Columbia who've already been caught up now in deportations. I don't think all three are Columbia students. There's one who the administration said was a Columbia student, but that seems false. But it does seem to be someone who was participating in the protests at Columbia and who was here on a student visa, but apparently was not a student at Columbia. She was a student at some other university. Her name is Lika Cordia, and Lika Cordia was deported, but also her student visa had already expired. So I think that was a little bit of a lower hanging fruit. So this is someone who was already not in school anymore, was already not lawfully present in the country anymore because her student visa had expired and she was no longer a student. And they picked her up and deported her. I don't think she's got much of a case, but I think the administration actually was, trying to pass it off as if she was another Columbia student because they're on this vendetta against Columbia, but it doesn't seem she ever had anything to do with Columbia. And then the third one is someone named Ranjani Srinivasan. Ranjani Srinivasan is from India. She was a PhD student in architecture and urban planning at Columbia. Apparently, she lived in university housing, and a warrant was executed in her university housing while she wasn't there. The university seemed to be looking for her. I keep pronouncing these names right. The case we've been talking about, Mahmoud Khalil, she is someone who had been participating in protests, but had never done anything illegal, was never accused of any crime. But since she wasn't there when they searched her room and she got scared that they're going to arrest her and detain her like they did to Khalil, she, what they call voluntarily self-deported. So she just got on a plane and went to Canada. And then the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, started crowing, a victory lap about that. We got another one of these people to self-deport. But, I guess just like Khalil, it doesn't seem to be that she actually ever did anything illegal, but she's out of the country now.
Yeah, not a development that either of us are certainly thrilled with. That's for sure. And I'm sure there'll be more on this to come. But we're right. One of the things, Ken, that you never get to do when you're on the shows with Trey is take questions from listeners. We have a little more time, and so I thought we could do that, especially because we have two Democrat identifiers on the show. And so there was a question from Jordan who thought this would be appropriate given that you and I are going to be doing the show together. And Jordan asked that, now that the post-election dust has long settled, we've had all kinds of time to think and lament and dry our tears and that sort of thing, right? And we've also had more than enough time to get a sense of what Trump's second term is shaping up to be. Jordan wondered what we see as the factors behind Trump not just winning, but sweeping the swing states, I can speak, winning the popular vote, as well as, this is the big part, I would say, what we think Democrats can do to combat this Trumpist policy agenda. So I'll let you start with that, and I'll kind of chime in.
First, I want to just give a slight correction to Jordan's question. Trump did not win the popular vote. He did get more popular votes than his main opponent, Harris, but he got not 50% of the popular
right, not a majority.
Vote. So right. Yeah, right. If you count all the third-party candidates that some people also voted for, then more Americans voted against Trump than for Trump. In terms of the main factors behind the swing states, I do need to emphasize, how close that was. It was only 250,000 votes spread across a few swing states that tipped the election, right? So what about 150 million votes were cast in this election, and about 250,000 votes made all the difference. So it's not as much of an uphill slog as it might look like when you look at the electoral map to turn the election. It was very, very contingent on some very small margins in just a few states. And it could have it could have been Harris that had like the blowout in the Electoral College if about 250,000 votes had gone the other way. So what can Dems do? Well, I agree with something you said earlier, Michael. The most useful tools that the Dems probably have right now are using litigation in the short run to address a lot of the illegality, and then, using popular opinion to try to, get people more inclined to vote for Dems in the midterm. we only have one historical model for exactly what he's doing now, and that is 2016, when he came in. And, his first 2 years in his first term were terrible, but not even anywhere near as terrible or as destructive or as drenched with illegality as what we're seeing in his first 2 months right now. And by the 2018 midterm, the voters had enough, and there was a massive blue wave in the House. And I think that is certain to happen. I think the House will go Democratic without much effort, actually. I think the Dems don't need to even do very much to ensure that they'll take back the House in 2026, because Trump's the chaos that he's been causing, his public opinion numbers are going down fast. I think one thing that helps that is that he can be linked to Musk. So the more that the President Musk meme is kind of advanced, Musk is even more unpopular than Trump. Musk is in fact functioning as president for most purposes, and so I think that really helps with the degradation of Trump's public opinion numbers. The Senate, unfortunately, is going to be a much harder slog. It's not a great map, and the Dems are going to need 4 pickups, and I'm not sure that I'm seeing them. So I think politically, while I'm pretty confident that the Dems can pick up the House, I don't actually have any kind of thought that they can pick up the Senate or hope for or plan for how they would do it. But I think it would help a lot to pick up the House. And, and I do think, the impeachments can start again, and should, not just of him, but when the Dems pick up the House, I hope to see quite a lot of impeachments of the Trump administration as well as Trump after the midterm. And I think really, I guess the final question that I'll address on the politics of it is, I know you probably know, Michael, James Carville has been calling for the Dems to basically lay low. I
was just going to say that. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not for that. I think that the Dems need to really be, when they vote against things, even though they're going to be outvoted all the time, they need to constantly be out there, explaining what's going to happen because they were outvoted. Because we were outvoted on this, there's all these plane crashes. Because we were outvoted on this, the stock market plummeted by 10%. Because we were outvoted on this, Trump is laying off all these veterans and accusing them of doing bad jobs without any evidence. I think they need to be making this case all the time. And I think that making the case will do more I don't think they need a positive agenda of their own. I just think they need to be making the case that all the things that Trump is doing and they're trying to stop, are inflicting harms on real people, and that will also help erode the support for Trump.
Yeah, I think you're largely right. I don't have a lot to add to that. Though I think there is something to what Carville and some others have said, is that maybe it's not just do nothing, but it's make sure you don't commit any unforced errors. There are plenty of things that are really big issues with a very small and vocal segment of the Democratic base that are not going to help in those kind of in between competitive districts that we're going to need to get a decent majority in the House so the investigations and whatnot can begin. And ideally, if not in 2026, but in 2028, to set ourselves up to get a majority in the Senate again as well. And so I think that needs to be part of the equation. I think that's part of what Schumer was doing, certainly. And so I do think there's a role for that.
Yeah, but, I don't think the problem is, I don't think the Dems can abandon some important issues, even if those issues are seeming to be working for Trump right now. Like the for instance, I know the public mostly seems to be on Trump's side on immigration, but like we were just talking about with this Khalil case and this illegal deportation, I don't think the Dems can abandon people like Khalil. I think they really have to call out the illegality here. Even if you look at it and say, well, but maybe a lot of the country, if they hear that he's that he's deporting a Hamas terrorist, most people are going to support that. But the Dems have to point out he's not deporting a Hamas terrorist. He's just lying and deporting some hapless student and calling him a Hamas terrorist. And I don't think they can lay low on stuff like that, even though I take it that someone like Carville would say that's a hornet's nest you don't want to get into.
Yeah, and I think maybe I have. Maybe because I'm more of a centrist, I tend to like that approach a little bit more. For instance, on the Khalil issue, I would argue that the approach would be to say, listen, the Trump administration is doing this in a legal way, and we should we're the party of law and order now, and we believe he should go before an immigration judge, and the law should be, whatever, that process should be allowed to play out, not these kind of weird police statey sort of activities of moving him around and not giving him access to his attorney. What kind of person does that? We can hit on that. And I think that's the sort of thing that Americans will say, yeah, that sounds a little sketchy to us. But if we're saying, well, we think we really want to protect this guy who's screaming these anti-American, pro-Hamas kind of things, I don't know if that's a winning issue for Democrats.
Well, but what I'm saying is he's not screaming these anti-American, pro-Hamas kind of things. And so sort of even accepting, letting Trump get away with those kind of lies, I think isn't good. I think kind of the idea that Trump gets to sort of, just tell lies and then sort of by that, sort of creating the sort of accepted set of facts that people then have to debate within doesn't seem useful to me. I think it seems politically important to me to call out lies all the time.
I hear what you're saying. I probably think that based on what I've read about Khalil's activities, I tend to think he might be a little more anti-American, a little more problematic, some of those things than you do. But anyway, so.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that brings us to the end of our episode. And hey, if you listen to this point, thank you so much for listening all the way through. And again, really, we're at a critical point. If you can support us, we really would appreciate that. We always put the links in the show notes, so check that out. If you become a supporter, you get ad-free versions of everything we release. You get the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 10 to 15-minute preview snippet. You get to be on our Politics Guys Discord group, which can be a lot of fun, sometimes pretty exasperating. I come in kind of hot sometimes and emotional there, more so than on the show. But anyway, we really would appreciate that. And if you want to get that full midweek episode, but finances prohibit you from supporting us, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. I'm happy to do that. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help with those algorithms if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're listening on, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and I almost forgot him, Derek Schmidt. Thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate it. We'll have a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,